Hello everyone. We have yet again another set of smaller missing persons cases out of Canada to talk about today. We have a man who was in the middle of his cross-country road trip when he'd never make it to his final destination. We have a young woman who wasn't reported missing for nearly 30 years that has yet another shocking tie to true crime. A man who went missing after getting into an argument with a friend. And another whose car would be found burned on the side of a country road. All of these cases are unsolved and lesser known, so let's help change that. 55-year-old Keith Zajac was from Squamish, British Columbia, a town 60 kilometers north of Vancouver, and he was married to his wife, Pam. He was described as the absolute salt of the earth, who was easygoing and would give you the shirt off his back. On July 29th of 2022, Keith left home to drive 2,700 kilometers across the country to Fort Frances, Ontario. He was going there to meet his uncle and brother for a planned fishing trip. The last time Pam spoke to her husband, he mentioned he was feeling ill and thought it could be heat stroke. His phone also didn't seem to be working correctly, but she expected to hear from him once he arrived in Fort Frances. After talking to his wife, Keith ended up calling his mother. Pam saying, and I quote, he had spoken to his mom Sunday night after he had spoken to me, telling her to ask Uncle Stanley and his brother Jeff to stop phoning because he couldn't answer it and he couldn't get the voicemail. She had asked him, where are you? And he said, I don't know. End quote. However, a few days later, Pam still hadn't heard any update from her husband and she began to worry. So she reached out to his Uncle Stanley and his brother Jeff, thinking that maybe they all just got preoccupied fishing and everything was okay. However, when she talked to them, they told her that Keith had never arrived. It's believed that Keith spent the night of January 31st at the Super 8 Hotel in Brandon, Manitoba. This meant Keith made it 3/4 into his trip before he'd disappear into thin air. By August 2nd, Keith's family had reported him missing. At first, Keith's family thought that this would all be very simple to figure out, that he said he was feeling ill, maybe he was having some kind of medical episode and so he checked himself into the hospital, or maybe he collapsed somewhere and was admitted to a hospital under a John Doe. His brother Jeff saying, and I quote, there's something going on with him and he needs help. If he's in some kind of medical emergency or some kind of medical episode. I just hope some people are understanding, and if they see it, they contact the RCMP right away. End quote. Unfortunately, the next day, Blue Hills RCMP would receive a report of an abandoned vehicle on the side of Highway 1 at Highway 495 West in the rural municipality of Whitehead, an area just west of Brandon. This vehicle would turn out to be Keith's. A witness would end up reporting seeing a man matching Keith's description hitchhiking east on Highway 1. Another witness who claimed to have seen Keith on the highway reported he was actually hitchhiking west on Highway 1 on August 1st. So at this point, it was seeming like maybe it was possible his car broke down and he had hitchhiked somewhere, but unfortunately, he may have been met by foul play because of that. It also makes me wonder if his vehicle was investigated, if he had ran out of gas, if there was some kind of malfunction, or if his car was completely fine, which would also be very strange then because it would make me wonder if these witnesses were incorrect. Maybe something had happened to him and whoever did something to him drove his vehicle there to make it look like something had happened. But I haven't really found any information on his vehicle. Keith's family would end up hiring a private investigator to help represent them in the searches. Although it's been nearly 2 years since Keith has disappeared, it's still very important if you have any dash cam footage saved or any surveillance footage, please look through it and please turn anything in that seems suspicious. As time rolled on and the winter storms did as well, the family's optimism started to fade that they would find Keith alive somewhere very quickly. Jeff would say, and I quote, it may not be a rescue, it might be a recovery, but I'm still quite hopeful. I'm finding having to come home and talk to my sons and my parents has been very hard. It's a lot easier to communicate with the professionals there than deal with the emotions here. End quote. A lot of searches have gone on over the last couple of years, yet there has been no evidence or signs of Keith anywhere other than his vehicle being found. It's another one of these cases of a man going missing on a rural road, and it's also strange that Keith was mentioning to family that he was feeling ill or something was off with him, yet if he did have a medical episode, why wasn't he just, found sitting in his vehicle or somewhere? To me, that might have just been a completely separate incident. Maybe he did get heat stroke or something, and then it seems like maybe something happened to his vehicle, maybe it did break down. Again, if we would know if there was something wrong with it, possibly if police let that out. So it's complete speculation if something did or not. But since there are 2 witnesses that claim to have seen him walking on the side of this road, it is possible, in my opinion, that someone did stop and pick him up if he was hitchhiking. And unfortunately, he may have gotten into the wrong person's vehicle. But it's been nearly 2 years now, and there is still no answers for this family. There is still no evidence, and no one knows where Keith is. Where is Keith? What's different from Keith's case compared to the other cases of missing men that we've been covering is that Keith wasn't intoxicated, as far as we know, and he wasn't staying in that place for long. He was taking a road trip across the country and just vanished 3/4 of the way there. He didn't have ties to that town. He was just stopping there to sleep and then should have went on his road trip farther. It also makes me wonder, could something have happened to him at the Super 8 motel maybe? Is there surveillance footage of him leaving there? I have a lot of questions, but at this point, all of them are unanswered. Keith is said to be 5'10", around 170 pounds, with blonde hair, a blonde beard, and blue eyes. His family is still waiting for answers. 24-year-old Belinda Williams would last be seen by her sister and father in July of 1976 in Vancouver, the last known sighting of her being in Mission, British Columbia, a city 60 kilometers east of Vancouver. What happened to Belinda after that is a complete mystery. 3 years later, her niece Lorelei Williams would be born, and it's said as she grew up, she had a striking resemblance to her aunt. However, Belinda wouldn't be reported missing until nearly 28 years later, in February of 2004. Belinda's niece sang, and I quote, "I have seen what it did to them growing up as a kid. Every time I talked about my aunties, their voices would shake." End quote. Now, oddly enough, Belinda wasn't the only person in this family to disappear. In 2002, their cousin Tanya Hollick was named one of Robert Pickton's victims after her DNA was found on his farm. And if you didn't know, Robert Pickton is a very prolific serial killer from British Columbia. He would basically hunt prostitutes in the Vancouver area and bring them to his farm and murder them. And it's a huge, huge case. If you don't know about it, I definitely recommend looking into that case, watching documentaries and stuff. It's absolutely horrific and wild. I'm pretty sure police officers would come and party on his land. Like, it was just a mess. But what if Belinda's cousins was one of his victims? That is just insanely heartbreaking. And it makes people wonder, could Belinda have met a similar fate? Despite not knowing much about her aunt, Lorelei has been advocating over the years for her and started a group called Butterflies in Spirit in 2011, which aims to raise awareness for Canada's Indigenous missing and murdered women and supports a federal inquiry into the issue. Belinda is described as an Indigenous woman standing 5'2", 117 pounds with brown eyes and black hair. She has a bee tattoo on the webbing of her right hand, a scar below one eye, and one on her right arm. She also had a crooked right little finger. Now, sadly, Belinda's case doesn't have much of any information. She wasn't reported missing for nearly 30 years. So it's going to be extremely hard for police to look into this, let alone us to even talk about what the circumstances may have been around her disappearance. But it does make me wonder if she was possibly hanging around in similar crowds as her cousin, if she would have met foul play in a similar fate. I mean, Robert Pickton didn't operate until the late 90s, so the fact that she was last seen in the 70s is, you can't really line that up possibly unless maybe she met a similar fate by a different killer. Because again, we have so many cases of Indigenous women disappearing in British Columbia specifically in and around these time frames, especially around the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia. But it is very strange that there are so many Indigenous women that have disappeared in British Columbia that just there's absolutely no evidence. It makes me wonder, maybe she tried to hitchhike somewhere. Maybe she did fall into a bad crowd or get lured off by someone similar to Robert Pickton that has just never been caught. Because clearly there is someone up there that hasn't been caught, because there are just too many missing women to say that it was all just coincidence. But hey, that's just my opinion. 32-year-old Kenneth Schmit was born December 6th of 1933 and eventually became a barrister and solicitor, practicing in St. Albert, Saskatchewan. On September 21st of 1966, Kenneth traveled from Prince Albert to North Battleford. He called his wife, who was back in Prince Albert that day, to let her know that he was going to go fishing with a friend named Horace Green. And after that, he was going to go look into purchasing a new car. The next day, on September 22nd, Horace and Kenneth ended up traveling to St. Walburg, to the home of a man called Mr. Romph, and they arrived around 6 p.m. Later that night, an argument would take place between Kenneth and Mr. Romph, causing Kenneth to allegedly leave the home around 10:30 p.m. But after that night, Kenneth was never heard or seen from again. Numerous searches would take place around the area where Kenneth had disappeared. The RCMP detachment in North Battleford would search the St. Walburg area with police dogs, as well as civilian personnel, but a lot of the area was said to be heavily wooded and marshy with bears. To make matters stranger, Kenneth was said to be in good health, he had no issues at home, and he had no reason to disappear. Since his disappearance, it said that no checks were ever cashed in his bank account, nor was his credit cards ever used again. In my opinion, with the little information that we have on Kenneth's case, I really wonder what police did to look into this mysterious Mr. Romph character, as well as the other friend that he was with there, Horace. It makes me wonder what the fight was about. Was it physical? Was it just verbal? Could it simply be Kenneth stormed out and then was met by foul play from a bear or something like that? Or makes me wonder if Kenneth ever even left that home, if we're going off the word of the men that he was arguing with. Kenneth is described as a Caucasian male standing 5'8", around 155 pounds, with brown hair and hazel eyes. He wore black-rimmed glasses and was last seen wearing black pants, a white shirt, and a wine-colored cardigan. 66-year-old Vernon Otto disappeared without a trace just a few years ago, so this is a newer case that doesn't have very much information. His wife would last speak to him on May 29th of 2018, around 12:40 p.m. Vernon was at their property in St. Clements, Manitoba, and told her he was going to speak to a neighbor about a vehicle ramp that he had lent them. Vernon also told her that he was going to go over to the Inner Lake area to look at some farm machinery, specifically a crawler. The last known contact anyone had with Vernon was around 1 p.m. that day, when he was believed to be working a field in the Steed, Manitoba area. Nearly 4 hours later, his white extended cab truck with gray decals on the side was reportedly seen traveling southbound on Highway 12 before turning west onto Road 94 North. Around 5:20 p.m. the next day, Vernon's truck would be found torched just a few kilometers from his home on Road 94 North, west of Highway 12. Police have said that they've received tips over the last few years that have led them to believe that Vernon was murdered. Which, I mean, his truck being found torched is definitely a bad sign. Authorities saying, and I quote, "We did have suspicions this was a homicide, but until we receive the tips and we combine that with the evidence we have gathered, we aren't in a position to publicly deem it a homicide until today." End quote. Which leads me to believe that police have evidence that they haven't revealed. Investigators still want to speak to anyone that may have had any contact or seen Vernon on May 29th, 2018, between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. Now, this is a very strange one because Vernon just seemed like he was having a normal day. He was working his fields on his farm. He had spoken to his wife. He was going to go look at some farm equipment and go talk to a neighbor about something he had borrowed. It makes me wonder if there was something more going on here. Clearly someone had it out for Vernon. When it comes to farming, I mean, I feel like it could be anything. Maybe someone was mad about a dispute about boundaries or some kind of crop they were growing that maybe was affecting their crop. That's just complete speculation on my part. I don't know what someone would have out on this older man who was just seemingly having a normal day. But clearly something very bad happened to Vernon if his truck was set on fire, because in my opinion, that means someone was trying to cover up evidence. Why they did something to Vernon, what they did, and what they did with his body is completely unknown at this point, but clearly police have some kind of information they're just not letting up. Again, this case is fairly new compared to some of the cases that we cover. Keith's case is also quite new, so it's interesting to see how there are both older cases that have little information, newer cases that have little information. But in this one, it seems like police have more than they're saying. Let's take one more good look at Vernon, because someone out there may know something. Everyone, for the most part, should still be alive in this case because it is so new still. And someone out there does know something. And hopefully this will spark some kind of memory. Maybe it'll convince someone to come forward. Because if anything, Vernon's family deserves answers. Vernon is described as a Caucasian male, standing 6'2" and around 200 pounds. He has blue eyes and gray balding hair. He was last seen wearing black jeans, a gold watch, and black casual shoes. Vernon's truck is described as a 2005 white Chevrolet Silverado 1500 extended cab with gray decals on the box, similar to the one pictured here. So what do you all think about these 4 cases? Again, I talked about 2 older cases that have little information and 2 newer cases that also have little information. Yet these 2 newer cases, I feel like they could be solved, especially Vernon's. Clearly, again, police have information they're not talking about, but all of them are equally as mysterious. How can we go from someone not being reported missing for nearly 30 years? No one was checking up on them, like not one person, to a man going missing in the middle of his road trip. With all of the cameras around today, you'd think that something would have captured him. All of these cases are just so strange. But what I also want to know is if you've ever heard of them before. Do you have any information I didn't talk about today? And what do you think may have happened to them? Spreading the awareness on these smaller cases is something I'm very passionate about. And I think if we share these cases and talk about them more, it could lead to getting more answers for these families and justice for these victims. Because no one's talking about them. So how is anyone supposed to know to come forward? I've left all of the appropriate authorities to contact in each of these cases if you have any information. Please share this video out or missing persons flyers for these individuals. I'll have all the sources down below. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.